Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. None of us goes through life unwounded. Physically, we may stub a toe, we may fall and get hurt, or break a bone. And then there are the psychological wounds, particularly those that come from people who matter to us. We may be hurt by our parents, teachers, friends, or romantic partners. When we attend to our wounds, they may actually provide unexpected gifts or strengths. But when we don't, they can fester, and we can inadvertently cause others harm or pain. Dr. Michael Meade is a mythologist, professor, author, podcaster, storyteller, and personally one of my all-time favorite thinkers. This is his second visit to my podcast, and I think you, my listener, will take away many gems from this conversation. So listen in as Michael and I talk about how our wounds form us and what we can do to both heal and help bring these unexpected gifts to ourselves and to others. Dr. Michael Meade, who has asked me to call him Michael, a hearty welcome back to Super Psyched.
Great to be with you, Adam.
One thing I say in your absence, and I will share it with you, is that there are two men walking the planet who I consider the wisest men living today. One of whom is James Hollis, and the other is you. And so much of what you have done, and I want my listeners to hear this, has informed my life. I was telling you offline that it even helped me prepare myself for the man I wanted to be in marriage and as a father. And I want you to know this and hear this from me rather than me just say it behind your back.
Well, thank you. Very kind of you.
So today I'd like to talk about wounds that we carry from childhood, wounds that we think will go away, wounds that we may actually undervalue for perhaps the lessons they've taught us, but perhaps in some cases, they may have kept us from actually evolving to the people that we would like to become. You write a lot about the relationship between son and father, and oftentimes, like with the story, you'll have to listen to this, folks, of the boy who goes out chopping wood with father, and the father thinks the son is an idiot for being a schooled person and doesn't know the world. And there are other betrayals that transpire. One of the things you even describe is that a betrayal can only happen from our own. And I think that's a really important point, and I hope that we'll revisit that. But I'd like you to just talk about some of the wounds you've seen over the years as they've manifested in men, perhaps the types of parentally generated wounds that you've seen that last throughout one's lifetime. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, because I like to look at things mythologically, and in mythic terms, everyone born is wounded. And the first wound is the separation from eternity, because the soul comes from the world of the eternal and it comes into the world of time and space. And so we enter the world unknowingly, because we're infants, having lost the connection to the eternal. And that's the first wound. And of course, that wound gives rise to all the religions and everything, everyone trying to find their way back to be connected to the eternal. But then anybody who knows depth psychology knows that the thing we're trying to connect to is deep within us. So we carry a wound that you can convert into the dynamic between the ego or the little self and the deep self. The deep self or deep soul, I use both terms, is the part of us that is eternal. And the ego or the little self is the part of us that is pretending to know what it's doing, but really terrified ultimately. And the distance between those two is similar to the distance between being born into the manifest world and having been in the eternal world. And so every human is wounded. That's the old idea. Now, there's another old idea that I really love, which is the more conscious we become of the wound, the more it becomes a womb. The wound, which is like an opening, can become the wound. And in depth psychology, there's the idea that it's our wounds that are keeping us alive. And so there's these other ways of looking at the woundedness. But the next wound after the wound of being born itself, at least in the way I imagine it, is the wound between the infant and the mother. And it doesn't have to be the mother, but it's whoever is mothering, where the infant wants to bathe in the adoring eyes of its mother. And according to the way I understand psychology, at certain critical moments, the infant is feeling like good about itself, feeling some kind of inner specialness. And at that time, it looks towards the mother, who is like a goddess, for the nodding, adoring look. And mother doesn't have to be a bad mother. She just has to have other children or have a job or have a husband, something that causes us to turn away when the infant is waiting for that beautiful, adoring gaze. And that separation, in my storytelling version of psychology, is when the ego is born. That the ego is born to protect the infant from ever feeling what amounts to obliteration or annihilation. And so the ego, the little self, is afraid that if it doesn't keep forcing the issue, keep pretending that it knows what it wants and what it's doing, that the alternative is obliteration. And then, of course, it turns out that the fear of obliteration and abandonment is in the way of the little self finding out there's a deeper self. We are not the things that we are made of because of the family and because of the community and the historical conditions. We are this unique soul that is connected to a deep sense of self that is not undaunted by the world, that does know why we're here and does know what our calling in life might be. And so the wound then becomes the wound between the ego or the little self and the deep knowing self. That becomes the wound. And yes, the parents have a lot to do with that. And in the parental area, I want to name one other wound, and this goes to the fathers. In my family, I was one of 5. I have 2 sisters and 2 brothers. And one time, my 2 brothers, who were both younger than I am, we were together as adults, and we were talking about things, and talking about our father. And I said something about when my father wounded me really deeply when I was like 10 or 11 years old. I felt it. It was like a crushing blow, and it was like a curse. And I'm telling my 2 brothers, and one of them says, well, he never said that to me, but he said this to me. And then the other brother said, he did this to me. And I suddenly realized this guy was incredibly accurate. He was accurately able to wound us each in the place where we were already wounded.
Where it would hurt most.
Where it would hurt the most. And so there's a way in which the wound wants to be healed. And the old term was it wants to be blessed. But blessing comes from a French word, blessure, which means wound. So the blessing we most want is in the place where we're most wounded. So I'm naming 2 parental wounds. One is rejection or seemingly abandonment by the mother or who is ever mothering. And then one is like a curse from the father. For instance, my he said to me at a critical moment when I thought I knew what he was thinking. I was studying my father, was hunting my father. I was trying to figure out what keeps him alive. He hated his job. I don't think he liked his marriage. And I wanted to know what keeps him alive. And so after studying him carefully, I said something that I thought he would approve of it in a big way. And it had to do with people. He loved tap dancing. And it had to do with evaluating tap dancers. And he just turns to me. I'm like 10 years old. And he says, if you knew anything about it, you'd already be up there. And that was like a spell. Like if I knew anything, I'd already be up there. If I'm not up there, therefore I don't know anything. It felt like a curse, really.
You really wanted to be seen in that moment. You see me, Dad.
But also, my life was aimed at eventually being on stage.
Exactly.
You see, the accuracy is mind-boggling. And this is well known because the Chinese say it with a proverb. They say there's a hole waiting for the husk of the boar. In other words, we have a gaping wound, and I was opening it to my father in a sense, wanting a blessing. And instead, because he didn't live out his life, something caused him to tell me, you're not going to do that either, or you can't, or you didn't, or I don't know what it was. It was like a curse. But I encountered that in high school too. My friends and I were the kids that were in trouble. I had high grades and really bad behavior. That was a problem for the teachers. And I hung out with all the guys that caused trouble. But we used to go up to certain teachers and go kind of like open our hearts to see if we could get a blessing because it is so necessary. And so you begin to get these series of wounds that are all lined up with the original wounds. And the other way I learned about it was working with battle veterans and deep levels of PTSD. And when we would trace their wounds from war and the post-trauma, if you really trace them, it would go all the way back to not just childhood, but infancy. So I think of it, we're all on the healing road. We're all supposed to be on the healing road. But when we begin to heal the wound, that very wound that is the deepest and seems annihilating, it becomes a womb from which we keep being born. So that's my theory of woundedness.
You heard that pause because I'm taking it in.
Yeah.
There's so much that you said that I wrote down a half page of notes. First off, when you said separation from eternity, I had a visceral response. When you hear the truth, when your body confirms it, and my body said yes to that. I felt it for good or for bad. I have a really powerful memory. And I can even remember things that transpired before I was the age of 1. And the idea of the separation from eternity feels so spot on. I've never heard it said even remotely like that. I know the Greeks said something kind of akin to before we were born, we knew everything. And then when we were born, we lost it all. But there's something that gets me right in the gut. The other thing that hit me was we look at a medical and well-researched book called the DSM. That is our diagnostic and statistical manual that's used in therapy, folks, if you're not familiar with it, but it describes all of the conditions that are known to mankind. And a hallmark within virtually all of them is disconnection. Just like what you were talking about within those wounds, the disconnection, the separation from eternity. It almost feels like they're echoes of the separation from eternity. And then I think about the idea of how big Marvel has become as a company creating these movies of superheroes with their backstories of the villains. And within all of those backstories are wounds, whether they are superheroes or villains. And it's almost as if the superheroes and the villains have a lot in common, except for the fact that they chose perhaps different paths with their wounds, consciously or unconsciously. And it seems that so much of it relates to mirroring, good or bad. In some cases, there's a mentor, but in many cases, there's this idea of this rugged individualism, which is a falsehood. We're all informed by others, whether they're, mentors or tormentors. And I'm also thinking about the power of parents. They're just trying to make it through the day. Your dad was trying to make it through the day. If I saw him in my office, I'd probably have a lot of empathy for the guy. He probably didn't know a lot of things and he was probably very scared. And if he was willing to acknowledge that. But in the meantime, you were asking, Dad, mirror me. And he said, well, if you knew it, you'd already do it. And lo and behold, boy, did you ever do it. And it was the backstory of a superhero story. You went so hard on this that you could, for the sake of good, entrance an entire group of 300 men through your drumming, storytelling, wisdom, through your reflections on the storytelling themselves. I make it a point to listen to The Water of Life at least once a year. I give it to a large number of my male clients. It resonates with all of them. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this idea of the trajectory over time, perhaps of the superhero versus the villain, and what might make the difference between us going for the good or maybe for the other.
So Water of Life, which is the first book I wrote, and it was a story that gave me permission to write a book because it was so compelling to me. And so that's like 400 and some odd pages. But you know who are avid readers of that book? Women, for two reasons. One is they get insights into men, the masculine psyche. And the other reason being all the wounds are the same once you get deep down far enough. And what we share, even though right now you have men and women, the masculine and feminine, being polarized again. It just happened in the recent election, but it's happened in elections all around the world. The pulling apart of the world is intensifying a polarization between the sexes, especially the young men and the young women, who are seeing the present and the future differently. And so part of the healing that we need, both personally and collectively, is healing all the things that are polarized. And one of the deepest things is the masculine and the feminine. And when it splits in a culture, it begins to split further inside people. And of course, every man has the feminine inside him. Every woman has the masculine inside her, like yin yang symbolism. And to become a grown man is to actually know something about the feminine within. And to become a grown woman is to know something about the masculine within. And when that happens, you find mutuality that is not simply equality, but it's actually a creative mutuality. But it only happens through attending to the wounds. And that makes me think of another idea. That which has been wounded by the feminine must be healed by the feminine. That which has been wounded by the masculine must be healed by the masculine. In other words, the way the psyche is set up, it actually is holistic in its way. And so I've worked with lots of women who have been sexually abused. Not just work with them, they'll come up and tell me about it because instinctively they're wanting to tell it to a man who might be able to say, I'm sorry, or I really sympathize or empathize or something like that. This old idea to me is resonant that the issues with my mother, I have to partially work out with a woman, with the feminine, you could say, psychologically. So anyway, the world of wounds is also the world of healing. And to heal means to make whole. And so the only way to become whole is to further enter the wounds that we have. So it makes me think of another thing. So I'll often have people tell their birth story or the way their family tells their birth story, because that's usually what we have. And when you examine that story, there's usually the wounds are right there, or there's hints of the wounds. And so if the idea is, and this is my favorite idea about human individual life, that we are here to transform and we are here to be reborn, not just one time. When I meet people that have been reborn, like in the Christian faith, and they say, I'm reborn, I say, good, but you're just beginning. We're here to be reborn and reborn and reborn. But we are born out of the conditions that we were in to begin with. There's some kind of a coherency between early abandonment and then I notice with myself, when I face a new kind of issue or something I'm afraid of, I go through a repetition of being born. I go right back into the way my mother tells the story about it, and I go back into my own experience of abandonment. So everyone's abandoned early in life. That makes me think of another idea, psychological idea, that there's many fears. I mean, right now we're living in cultures of fear, and it seems to get worse every week. But the two greatest fears, they say, are the fear of abandonment, which everybody has, and the fear of being overwhelmed by the world. And right now, most people feel abandoned by aspects of their own culture, even abandoned by nature, which is acting in unnatural ways. And most people are on the edge of overwhelm in fear of being overwhelmed by the conditions of the world in both nature and culture. So we're in a time where healing is more important perhaps than at any other time, and where the healing always has to start with our own wounds. And again, I just want to repeat, everybody's wounded. The people who say they're not are the most wounded because they're the most distant from their own wounds. And unfortunately, some of them get elected, and then you have the wounding of an entire culture because of electing people who won't even acknowledge their own wounds. And we're living through that too.
What are the first steps? You've walked with thousands of people as they've been attending to their wounds. What is something a person can actually do to begin the reborn and the reborn and the reborn?
Well, it's interesting, really, especially being in American culture or the Western world. The first move is always descent, because that's what the ego doesn't want to do. It doesn't want to go down. It's afraid of what's down there. And there is a zone of pain and fear, and I call it the emotional zone, a typical emotional arrangement for that person, which includes trauma shaped in a particular way. And what we're after is below that, the deep self, the deep soul. And so the idea is, in order to be reborn, we almost have to die in a symbolic sense by a descent into the depths of our own soul. And so COVID, for instance, when it spread over the world and became a global wound that was spreading from one person to another, that kind of wound, it pushed everybody into separation from others, therefore an experience of abandonment, and it pushed everybody into a descent. And so in ancient Greek culture, for instance, there was two kinds of descent: the accidental descent, when you're harmed or you have a sudden emotion that pulls you down, like grief or sorrow, and conscious descent, which I think was called katabasis, where you say, I'm going down, I'm going. Like in the middle of COVID, I just feel the overwhelming weight of this. I feel a kind of heavy shadow of darkness, and I'm going to go down with it. And so the first thing I think is for people to realize that descending and going down is not a mistake or an utter danger. It's actually the path to a deeper awakening, and it's really the path to a rebirth. If you imagine baptism, which didn't begin in religious circles, it began in ancient Africa, where a person would be baptized every time they were in trouble. Most villages, ancient villages, everybody would go down once a year, not to have a Christmas, New Year's bash, but to be descend into the water and start anew. So the baptism is a descent to the water from which everybody came, whether you want to consider it the waters of the womb or the waters from which life came. And so baptism was really an enactment of the descent to find something deep that you didn't have. And when you do it African style, it's the elders in the water that you go in and stand in front of the elders, and then they push you down and hold you there. And they hold you there until they think you've found something. I remember experiencing it and going, I hope this elder's not going to have a senior moment while I'm down here.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so the idea was everybody knew that to find a greater life and to find a new version of your life, you have to descend. And the Western culture, which has glorified light and white, avoids descent. And yet it's the only way to renew things. That descent is the first step of a rite of passage. So this is the next time that the wounds come in. So after you survive in some form or shape, the separation from eternity and then the separation from maternity, and then you survive the wounds of the father or the wounds of the absent father, depending how the story's going. And then you survive the wounds of your education and that kind of thing. But then at the end of childhood, developmental psychology is a brilliant thing. And it can take you through the steps in which you can insight into and understand all aspects of early childhood and later childhood. But developmental psychology stops in adolescence. You can't map out the rest of it because it's off the map. And the move from the end of childhood into a grown person is a leap that involves, theoretically, a descent in order to awaken to what's already inside and bring that to consciousness and then go on that path, no longer the child's path, but the awakening soul's path. And in the modern world, you don't have a rite of passage. And so it happens accidentally or haphazardly or in some way that makes the trauma worse rather than better. But that's the next wound, would be the wound of initiation. And in ancient cultures, you were not a grown person if you were not initiated. And that's why they would have tattooing or scars that you could see. So when you met someone, you could tell, am I looking at an initiated person or a person who is not initiated to their own life? And so we've lost that now. And we've even lost the idea of it. And so that's where the superheroes come in, I think, is where Hollywood takes the longing for an awakening of a deeper self, which has its own, as they say now, superpowers, which I would call genius. So everybody enters the world with a genius that they don't know, and everybody's born into a family that can't recognize their genius, typically. If they do recognize it, they often then start to manage it, which distorts it. But anyway, then we're supposed to go through a rite of passage in which we encounter our own genius, our own inner talents, as well as our inner wounds. And the two are related. They're the two deepest things in the soul. Carl Jung said, genius hides behind the wound. If we avoid the wound, we lose the genius. Genius is an old Latin word, and it means the spirit that's already there. The spirit that's there when we're born. And yes, it can have talent, or it can be very smart, or it can be very empathic. There are people who are genius at being empathic, and boy, do they live with wounds. And they need a whole different kind of initiatory awareness because they're going to empathize with everybody's wounds, which makes them very deep into the wounded world, and they have to have medicine in order to be themselves. Other people will have a genius that's going to take them into the world of music or art, or even, surprisingly, politics. And so everybody has that. Most people are not awakened to it. So people have the wound without the genius. They have the wound without the gift. And rite of passage, in its deepest sense, would have given each person an opportunity to awaken to who and what they already are, which is gifted in a certain way and wounded in a certain way. And the rest of life is going on the healing road to heal the wounds and learn how to give the gifts better. That's the story I like.
Thinking of, as you're saying this, we've replaced wisdom-based traditions, ancient traditions that are really beautiful in nature in terms of rites of passage, with ideas that you get a college degree from a fancy university, you go on and get a job, you rise from somebody who reports to a manager, to a director, to VP, to CEO. You have this type of car. These things are supposed to serve, I believe, as proxies, and they are so hollow. They do not give the people what they're really looking for. And I have hard evidence to that idea. And yet, on the other side of it, people might say, I'm so busy with all of the things that I have to do, being a parent, being a member of society, being somebody who works for this company, I don't have time to go down. And I was wondering, somebody comes to your workshop, presents in this way, saying, I really, really hunger for this. My soul is hungering for this, and yet I have a mortgage. What do you say?
Well, what I do is I tell stories. So I tell a story. We were talking before recording about the tiger's whisker. This beautiful story about a young woman who has lost her lover. He went off to war and he made it back, but he was a different person. And whereas he had been gentle and intimate, he now was distant and hard and angry. And so now she's going through abandonment all over again, and her wounds are activated, and she can't fix it. She can't heal him. We know how many times people try to do that. It doesn't work. And she finally realized she has to heal herself. And she goes looking around the world. She goes wandering, trying to find that kind of healing. And nothing works. Like if it was a modern day story, she tried Reiki, and then she tried, behaviorism and whatever, but it didn't work. And finally, she's feeling abandoned again. And she's in a marketplace, and she hears someone talking about a healer who lives up on this mountain, outside the village and up on a mountain. And she realizes she has to go to that. Anyway, she leaves the daylight world and enters the cave. She enters a cave that goes into the depth of the earth, which is where, by the way, the word therape, is a Greek word for the people who used to live in caves and interpret dreams. Therapy comes from that.
I did not know that.
Yes. And of course, Plato's cave and all that. So anyway, the caves were the ancient sanctuaries inside the body of Mother Earth. And she goes in there.
It's a womb.
Yeah. And then she finds the healer who's deep in there. And at first she can't even see. It's just all darkness. And she's a flicker of light. She heads towards it, and she recognizes it. It is a flame from a fire. And there's someone sitting hunched over the fire. She thinks that must be the healer. And she interrupts. She apologizes for interrupting. And she says, I need healing for this wound. And the old healer in there says, healing for a wound, healing. Everyone in the world wants some healing. And she goes, oh my God, I didn't mean to upset you. And he said, no, I'm over that now. And she says, the wound is I lost my love, and I'm afraid I'll never love again. And then the healer says, okay, come back in 3 days. Because that's the old thing about healers. You're supposed to take in whatever you've gathered from the person, the patient, whatever the term is, and then you sit with it for 3 days to see if you have something to offer or not. There was an old idea of kind of shamanic healing. She comes back 3 days later, leaves the daylight world, enters the cave and the womb of the mother, and finds the fire and finds the healer who says, okay, there's a cure for your wound. And I've gathered everything that's needed except for one thing. And the question is, are you willing to go find the one thing? And she says, of course, this is more important than anything in my life. And so the healer says, okay, what's missing is a whisker from the head of a living tiger. And then she says, how could I do that? How can I face a tiger? And then the healer says, I thought you said this was the most important thing in your life. She said, okay. And she bows and she leaves. she remembers that actually on the other side of that same mountain, there is said to be a wild tiger that lives in a cave. So now she knows she has
By
to
the way,
go.
once again, a cave.
Yeah. Not
Very
only
lovely.
that, on one cave on one side of the mountain is the healer, on the other side is the dangerous animal. So you can see the architecture of the story is beautiful. So she realizes she has to go up there. She's now just dwelling on this, like we would call it meditating, or what do I do? How do I do this? She's cooking rice, and as the steam is rising up, she realizes, wait a minute, a tiger must be hungry also. And why don't I bring food to the tiger? And so she puts some meat sauce in there because tigers eat that. Anyway, the tigers aren't vegetarian. So she goes up the trail, and she goes up in the evening because that's when this whole thing happens. And she goes as far as she can into her fear and darkness. And she can't go any further. She puts the bowl down and goes back to her hut. And the next night she cooks the rice and she takes it up again. And sure enough, the bowl is empty. She steps over the empty bowl and she goes as far as she can into her own fear of darkness and her wounds and everything. And then when she can't go further, she puts that bowl down. And she keeps doing that night after night until one night when the moon is rising full in the sky and dropping its liquid white light down on the earth as she's going up, and she steps over the empty bowl and she's about to put the bowl down, and she sees the tiger right before her. And she suddenly just freezes and realizes, I have to do it now. I have to put down the bowl and I have to take the whisker. This is what my life is about.
This is my moment.
This is my healing moment. And she puts down the bowl and the tiger starts to eat. And then she says, excuse me, I don't intend any harm, but simply I have to take one of your whiskers. And she takes a whisker right from the edge of the mouth of the tiger. And she steps back and the tiger pretends not to notice. Great part of the story, that if we can get that close and reach for the healing, the other world is trying to come to us too. The healing. Anyway, she now has it and she dances her way down in the moonlight. I've got it. I've got it. And she can't even sleep, of course. So exciting. And the next day she's bringing the whisker to the healer in the cave. She goes all the way up the mountain, leaves the daylight world, go down into the cave, into Mother Earth, down to where the healer is. And she says, I got it. I've got the whisker from the head of a living tiger. And the healer says, let me see. I got to check this out. The healer is examining it and then just drops it right into the fire. And the whisker is consumed and turned into ashes while she stands there aghast. She starts to say, how could you do that? You told me to get it. I went through that night after night, all my fears. And then the healer says, tell me this. Is the presence of another person, a human, more fearful than the presence of a living tiger? And she says, of course not. And then the healer says, well, then there's no reason to be afraid of not loving again. There's no reason to go back with what you know about your own self and your own wounds and the tiger. There's no reason not to go back to the world and live fully and love fully. And then she just says, thank you. She bows, goes back from the cave into the world. And that's the end of the story. It doesn't say she became Superwoman or whatever the Marvel version is, but she became herself. And she had several times descended into the darkness of the cave. And she also had stood in the face of her own fears, which I was saying earlier, you could consider the fear of abandonment and the fear of overwhelm. She faced both of those, and she found a love that she thought depended on someone else. And it actually depended on her loving and accepting herself with her wounds and also with her hidden gifts.
One of the great stories, and even hearing it again for the second time from you, I heard it first in the 90s and now today, more than 24 years later. And even knowing what was going to happen to the whisker, I was still heartbroken to hear that it was thrown into the fire. But you and I both know that, sure, medication can be very assisting and very important and maybe necessary for many people. But that alone doesn't do the trick. We have to summon up the courage to live and to go into the caves that call to us, as this cave did to her.
Yeah, and probably keep going into caves to go through it again. The idea is you go back through the wound. You keep going back through the wound as if we are to be birthed from our own wounds. And then I love the fact that Jung, there's no explanation of that I found of why he said that. Everyone is gifted when they come into this world, and everybody's wounded. He said the gifts and the genius hides behind the wound. And so that's our job, is to find our inner gifts and learn how to give them. But if we don't heal the inner wounds, we actually fall into them in a bigger way. And you see that with a person who becomes a celebrated musician or a Hollywood actor or actress. As they rise, if they're not on the healing road, they crash. Something goes really wrong. Drugs, all kinds of stuff happens because the wound is not being attended to, because the nature of the human situation is to be gifted and wounded. And every time we learn something about our own gift and how to give it, we have to attend to some wounding that stirs as well. Like a balloon, if it was a different color, one side is green and one side is red. And when you inflate it, they both get bigger. As we attend to it, both the gifts get bigger and the wounds get bigger. And eventually we just realize, I'm back down here again, or I have to go down again. And then it's much less scary.
That's right.
Because we've been through it again. And it doesn't wind up being a superhero or a superheroine. And actually, the supervillain is part of the wound. And the two start to integrate. Our own shadow side, our own dark energies get integrated with the brighter parts of ourselves. And we're on the healing road, like all the people we revere. We're all on the healing road.
I love it. And I've heard it said that money and power don't necessarily corrupt. They actually just shine a light and put a magnifying glass on the person. And you find out more about those wounds, who they really are in that way. I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but I find that to be in sync with what you're talking about.
The way an old proverb puts it, it's not simply that power corrupts. It's that power attracts the corruptible.
Wow.
Or let's say extreme power attracts the corruptible. Because those right now taking power around the world, because there's a lot more autocrats and dictators and would-be dictators and sycophants following the dictators. They're all hungering for power, thinking that like the whisker, is going to save them from their own woundedness. And if they don't engage their own woundedness and become conscious of that, they project their wound onto the people that they're supposed to serve. And then you have the autocratic regime, which poisons everyone. And that's happening in the world, all around the world now.
Why is it happening now?
My understanding, it's happening now, and it's happening at the same time that nature is in radical upheaval. To be alive right now is very unusual because nature is in upheaval.
That's right.
And culture is polarized and full of conflicts. So you used to be able to turn to nature. It's harder to turn to nature, especially with the knowledge that people have, that whole ecosystems are collapsing. It's hard to go for a walk in the woods and not realize, oh, wait a minute, that bird is one of the few, that kind of thing. So we're living at the end of something. People call it the end of the world, but in mythology, the end of one world is the beginning of the next world. In the ancient myths, or even if you take an idea like apocalypse, and a lot of people think the world is apocalyptic, which it is, but apocalypse means collapse renewal. It doesn't mean fiery end of everything. That's just what happened in the Bible. And in terms of the old word, which is an old Greek word, it means collapse and renewal. It also means lifting of the veil. So what's going on politically is the lifting of the veil. And the stuff that used to happen in the back rooms is happening right in front of everybody. We get to see the shadow, not just of the individuals, but the shadow of a culture being enacted real time, as they say, right in front of everyone. And it's there to educate us, I think, or that's one way to take it. People have to become more psychological, have to understand the woundedness that everybody has to understand that deep inside everyone, were we to awaken to it, is a deep knowing self and soul that knows specifically why we're here, how we can survive. And we survive not simply by protecting ourselves, but also learning how to give and learning how to heal. And the same thing is happening in the outer world as is happening inside people. The world is going through its trauma that has been building for a long time. But in mythology, it doesn't simply come to an end because the end becomes the beginning, like a story. Doesn't mean it's not painful. Doesn't mean it's not scary. It just means that in terms of myths, it doesn't come to an end. People are still reciting the myths from thousands of years ago because they are part of the universal and part of the deep truth and, in a sense, part of the eternal. And we can touch the eternal by getting in touch with our deeper self, by being in touch with meaningful myths, and by allowing ourselves to live more fully. At least that's what I would say.
I'm going to rewind to something you said earlier, and that is that it's mimicking nature. And I had Julian Treasure on. He is a person who wrote a book on how to listen. And one of the things that he says troubles him more than almost anything is that the bird population has dwindled so much that we no longer hear birdsong. And the reason it's so important for our 35,000 plus year old brains is because when the birds are singing, we know we're safe. It's when the birds aren't singing that we aren't, and it registers in our brain.
Yes.
So living in these places where there is an absence of birdsong, or where it's being deforested and it's actually harmful to our psyches.
Totally. And it's very hard to not feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the companion thing you could say in the psychological realm is collective anxiety. If people are peaceful and going about whatever their work is or their play is, then everybody gets more relaxed. Now you have contact anxiety because someone going out to shop is maybe thinking about the ecosystems collapsing, or maybe thinking about the rise in misogyny. And all of a sudden going to the grocery store means you're inhaling anxiety that other people are carrying. Even if you were okay when you entered the situation, you can leave feeling anxious and not knowing why. And so there's another, besides the absence, there's a presence. The vacuum is filled instead of bird songs, collective anxiety.
And that's the cacophonous sound rather than the mellifluous sound that we are accustomed to.
Yeah. And as more people get afraid, more people get afraid.
As more people get afraid.
And when people are afraid, those who want extreme power, who are empty inside, and people who are not dealing with their own wounds that think power is going to save them, as people become more fearful, those who want extreme power tell everybody they should even be more fearful. And that somehow gets them elected. And all of a sudden, our wounds collectively are running the country.
I'm going to repeat that. Our wounds are running the country. And the opposite of that, would it be our strengths running the country? Would it be our geniuses running the country?
You would hope for genius. Genius comes in many, many uncountable forms. There are people who are genius about how water works in nature. There's people who are genius about mushrooms feeding the roots of trees. There are people who are genius about how you sit with someone when they're dying. That's being reinvented as we speak. There are people that are geniuses at music and art and music are supposed to be with us like the birds. They're reinforcing the creative sense of being alive. And so there are people who are political geniuses, and you wish for them. You want to promote them. You want to support them. But that's not even recognized now because politics has become power all the way along. It is a gift in some people. Business is a gift for some people. Gifted business people should be successful. And then if they understand gifts and wounds, and they look at the wounds, they say, wow, I have become wealthy. And there's people who are very poor for reasons which we may not understand. I think I should be helping them, not just accruing more wealth than anybody could deal with. So you wind up, instead of a wise merchant, you have Elon Musk, a power-hungry, deeply empty person, rambling around the world, messing with things constantly that he doesn't understand because he has no idea who he is. That's just my take on it. But you get the idea, because now we have these giants acting it out. And so someone who had no boundaries when they were an infant now wants to build walls to keep people out. You can psychologically see that we have large figures acting out the trauma. What happens when it's not consciously dealt with? What happens when grown-looking people are actually deeply immature and deeply wounded and have never done anything about it? Like it or not, we get to see it. And it's not just the United States where we are. It's around the world. People are voting for would-be strongmen all around the world because of the layers of fear. And if people don't know who they are inside, they tend to vote for people who will never know who they are inside.
And it's almost as if you're making a case for the entire world to engage in something that very few people are willing to do, and that is reflect, be reborn,
we can't go back. A lot of us, we had this idea that I will go back to childhood. I just went back to Japan for the first time in 31 years. It was not the same Japan that I'd left 31 years ago. And I'm not the same person I was 31 years ago. I was vastly different. I had a wife and 2 children. And I think about this 800 plus year old poem that Robert Bly would often read at your gatherings about, has anyone seen the boy who used to come here? Round-faced troublemaker, quick to find a joke, slow to be serious, red shirt, perfect coordination, sly, strong muscles, with things always in his pocket, reed, flute, ivory pick, polished, and ready for his talent. You know that one. Have you heard stories about him? Pharaoh and the whole Egyptian world collapsed for such a Joseph. I would gladly spend years getting word of him, even third or fourth hand. I feel like that is a timeless tribute to this pursuit of something we will never get and should never get. We need to be reborn. We need to find ways not to go back.
To go deep.
Yes.
There's a way of going back by going deep. To the soul, deep and back are the same thing. In the outer world, back looks like a historical thing. Not only did we lose our connection to eternity or the divine or the eternal, but we are captured in linear time, in the march of time. People actually think that time is moving like that. People think clock time is the only time. So go back to Carl Jung, who took the old idea from ancient Greece of kairos, Kairos. A time of kairos is when everything becomes possible again. A kairos is, another way to describe it is the shifting of the archetypes. All the archetypal energies shift. They used to call it in ancient Greece a shifting of the gods. So another way to understand what's going on, it's not a minor change. It's not a historical alteration. It's a shifting of the archetypes. It's a shifting of the gods, which affects both nature and culture. And the way to understand it is inside it is the opportunity to awaken. That's the only valuable thing to do. But as everything is falling apart, there's more opportunities to awaken. The whisperings of the genius can be heard inside all of the changes going on. If a person stops and doesn't fall for the idea that the only world is the outside world, all of a sudden you're more in touch with the inside world. And at least according to the old idea, when it's falling apart, the kairos is in operation and there's an opportunity in the midst of the collapse for a genuine awakening. That's true in the individual life. I'll be with an audience of people and say, how many people have had their life fall apart? And almost all the hands go up. And some people are putting 2 hands up and wish they had more. We're all going, yeah. And there's the occasional person who doesn't put their hand up. And of course, they're in denial. All of our lives have fallen apart repeatedly a number of times. Something in us knows how to pull it back together, finds a thread, and all of a sudden we're making a comeback. We get in touch with that part. And then we're not just on the can we make it through life road, we're on the calling road. We're on the genius road. We're on the path of awakening. We become the inner initiate on the path of initiation. And that's what a grown person used to be. Someone who knew the path they were on. And if it was a political path, it wasn't just for power. That would be obvious, evident, and kind of foolish. It would have to be for a sophisticated learning about how groups of people work, that kind of thing. And even in my lifetime, I've seen politicians who carried that, who had that in them. So it is possible. But not just politicians, businessmen, doctors, everybody is really subject to a calling. And the more people that respond to the calling, the more wisdom is aggregated in the community and the greater capacity and the greater courage for change. And the next thing, things change. So since I said that, I just want to say this other thing that I love. A society doesn't change because everybody agrees on a new idea. Society changes because a number of souls or some proportion of souls awaken and live in truth was another term for it. They live in truth, live in their own truth. That is to say, a society changes one soul at a time. And yes, modern people often have the idea, I'm just a speck in this universe. I'm a speck even in this accidental universe is the most common idea. But what people don't know is the speck that we are has a speck of star in it, or has a spark of the divine in it. And when a person grows their life from the inside out, they add presence to the world, they add meaning to the world. And when enough people do that, then society changes. And so we're in that kairos where we are witnesses of things falling apart, and we're potential healers, potential gift givers, potential wise people. We are that. No one can take that away. That's part of human nature. But what we do with it is really up to us individually. And so that's why I love the old stories. The girl, the young woman who gets that whisker and faces the tiger, she's everyone's hero. She faces what she feared the most because she wanted love. She wanted to love and she wanted to be loved. And that's at the core of everybody. And the old healer sits in the cave going, everybody wants healing. So on the healing road, you have those days where you're going, God, what about me? Because the healer needs to have a way of healing also. And so to me, everybody's always on the healing road. And it's just more necessary now. And it's a harder road now.
You just mentioned the word terape for caves and therapy. And the word patient comes from pathos, one who suffers.
Yes.
And I would say that to live is to experience suffering, whether we acknowledge it or not. And it's far better if we acknowledge it because, to your point earlier, we can either help society through having healed our own wounds, or we can harm society by not having healed our own wounds. I guess I would ask you, since people do need to tap into those wounds, they do need to tap into their genius, what would your prescription be for people to become more awake?
So there's always the requirement of honest reflection. I'm more awake when I'm going, oh, I'm really scared today, or I'm angry again. I watch these political things happen and I get angry. I have no apology for that. Anger is the first emotion, a lot of people think. The infant, when it wants food, when it wants love, and it wants comfort, it gets angry and yells. And so to be angry is to say something has gone wrong. I feel violated somehow. And I watch the political news and I feel violated. All levels of my life feel violated. And of course, everybody has their own version of that. So the first thing is some kind of honest reflection that says, I understand this about my emotional state at the moment, or something like that. And then one thing I recommend is a practice. This has always been true, but it's really true now. In order to find ways to settle, in order to find ways to integrate all the disturbance going on, or to slough them off, a person needs, I call it arts and practices. And that's because it used to be, there were two roads you could go on. You had the contemplative road, meditation, and looking inward for knowledge and for peace and stillness, whatever the goal might be. And then you have the opposite road, the expressive road, the road of the expressive arts, where you're taking what's inside and you're putting it out. And so a person just has to figure out what they need and have a practice. I get up every morning and I write dreams down, I write ideas down, I rewrite things that might go into a book, because I just found for myself the act of writing engages my body and my mind and my soul, and it allows me to get coherence. I need a certain amount of time in that either study or writing mode to find some coherence. That's one of the things I do. Other people have to have a meditative space. And then there's many ways to meditate, and you can find it all on Google now. I mean, I used to play drums a lot. And the great thing about a drum, you can pound away on the drum, and the drum is happy that anybody's playing. It doesn't complain. You're not making a mistake. And I should just put all my energy into that drum. And what happens then is turning into rhythm. And it's echoing back to me a coherence I didn't even know I was connected to. Some people paint. People have to figure out what their genius nature is, and then have arts and practices. So yes, the world goes wrong again. Okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write, or I'm going to play music, or I'm going to go into a quiet place and meditate, or I'm going to go into nature and interact with nature. Whatever the calling is, it needs to become an art and or a practice, or else we get undone by the intensity of what's around us. And I'll say one other thing, really important. Carl Jung called it friends of the soul. We have to have friends that know us, and they know our good and our bad, and they still like us, that kind of thing. And we need companions on the path that we can share things with, who can resonate with it, give us a harmonic mirroring response, even if we never got it from our mother or father. You find friends who can give some of that. This is a long road now. The healing is not going to happen quickly, although changes can happen quickly. But it's a road that needs a lot of changes because of the great separation between nature and human culture and all the damage that was done in nature and all the trauma that winds up being generations of trauma that was done in human culture. And when things begin to pull apart, there's opportunity for healing and for reimagining, but it requires healing old wounds as well as the ones that we carry personally. And so practice and art and people that know us at a soulful level, people whom we know at a soulful level, so we don't feel alone in the world. And we have people to share with in a way that is meaningful for them and for us. Those are a couple of recommendations.
One of the things that I hear about most frequently, a theme in my office, is I'm working with very smart, amazingly cool people who don't have friends. It compelled me to give a TEDx talk on friendship and adulthood and how important it is to cultivate that community. On the other piece that you were speaking of, a mantra that I have is consume less, create more. People are consuming way too much, and it just contributes to the noise of the universe. But when we create more, I believe that we can offer more of our genius, whatever that might be.
Yeah. When people don't deal with emotional growth, emotional pain, wounds, and trauma, you get hollows. And
Right.
even people who are busy, I know for myself, I'll stop and I go, I don't know what to do. And I have to like breathe and go, wait a minute, maybe I'll listen to music or play music. And people have these hollow spaces that then advertise and fills them in. And nowadays, everybody has their own personal device to distract them endlessly. And so we have to be pretty alert and pretty clever to realize we're here to live out a meaningful life. And whether we do that or not affects other people and has an effect on the world.
And that device does not love us.
It can't.
I want to just thank you so much. I was reflecting on this stage of life I'm in now. And I'm remembering in the year 2000, you were teaching a group, particularly around grief and loss, particularly for Vietnam vets. There was a large number of them. And I was there. And I am the age now that you were when you gave that beautiful series of lessons that helped us. It was huge. And I just couldn't help note that here I am in this story, the age that you were when you taught me so much during that young stage prior to marriage. And I will continue to be reborn through a lot of your teachings. They never grow old. One of the things, folks, that Michael will say is that when the story no longer grabs you, that story has died for you in a sense. If it no longer has an element that teaches you, is instructive. And that's one of the reasons I listen to The Water of Life multiple times a year, because it always has an element that speaks to where I am at that time. It never doesn't deliver.
And of course, the essence of the story of The Water of Life is the king of the realm is dying and no one can find a cure. And because the realm is not working, nature is beginning to die because they were interconnected, as people have rediscovered. And what's missing is water, like everything is drying out, and in particular, the water of life. And here we are again. What's happening in politics, what's happening in terms of exploiting the earth, is people have forgotten the essential things like the water of life, the water from which life came. And we have to find that water for our own lives to flow, but also for culture to find a way to flow back into a consanguinity with nature. And so, yeah, that story, I could hear that story every day myself.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with my listeners. And I would encourage you, it's on Audible. It's the most delicious download you'll have in some time. The Water of Life, you can find it very easily. It's also probably, and Sounds True, it's probably in a host of other areas, perhaps even at your own website at Mosaic.
But the website also, Living Myth, is a podcast that comes out every week. And the idea is the medicine of myth on a weekly basis. It's free every week. People can join and support it, but it's free every week. And so you just download Living Myth, and I'm telling mythic stories and psychological kind of patterns that we can look at in order to live in a world that's overwhelming.
And I will share that in my notes. Michael, thank you.
Great to be with you, Adam. Great to talk before and during, and see you down the road.
I will always look forward to that.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.